Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gather for Her. And in this season 10, I can't believe it's season 10 already, given that we started this just at the very beginning of COVID, really, as a way to bring us together. So, welcome to Gather for Her, which is a powerhouse masterclass series exploring what it means to be a relational leader in these unprecedented times of global change. These conversations are offered to illuminate hope, to encourage possibility, and to challenge you to make the shift from individuated top down leadership to more heart centered and relational ways of being with each other. My name's Tina Overbury, or Tina O, and I'm your moderator. I'm an ally. I'm of settler heritage, and I'm currently living as an uninvited guest on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Skokomish people. I'm grateful to play, create, and do my best to steward the land where I rest my head, which is on Nehuelaquam, also known as Bowen Island. And I'm really grateful to be in circle with all of you this morning, with my co-conversationalists, Christina Benti, Charlene Senjenko, Sharon Marshall, and our special guest, which Charlene will introduce, Brenda Morrison, also my friend, our friend here. And in case some of you are new to Gather for Her and you don't know much about Powerhouse champions relational change makers and their organizations. We offer hands at your back support as you accelerate the social impact that you're here to make, and in this time in history, which has its own needs around it. Our impact media producer for Gather for Her is Regen Media, who invites us to take the power of media into our own hands by supporting stories that heal, regenerate, uplift, and transform. And we're here every 2 weeks. You can jump into our conversation here live on LinkedIn, followed by an hour-long wisdom circle, because these conversations, go in lots of directions, and they're multi-layered. And so we need to unpack them together. So you can join us on our hour-long wisdom circle where we unpack these concepts that are opened up here, held in our community of practice called the Leader Path, which is available to you as a membership, $25 per month. But I'll tell you more about that later. This is a live conversation. So we would love it if you would introduce yourself as a listener or a viewer in the chat. Here on LinkedIn, say hello, let us know where you're connecting in from with an acknowledgement of gratitude for the lands in which you rest, play, and grow. And know if you haven't done that before, the relational leadership approach is a practice and it can be awkward. And that's great. That's the whole part of the relationship thing. Like, let's learn together, practice together, breathe together, and just roll through this and connect. I also want to welcome Kelly Beatty, who's not here today, but she is joining our circle, as is Janet Mohappy Banks, as guest hosts on Gather for Her. They're not here this week, but you will see them. And so with that, let's begin. I'm going to pass over to my friend Christina Benti to introduce yourself, and let's get this conversation started.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tina. Oh, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I, as always, am thrilled to be here. And when I think about season 10 and the fact that we're in season 10, I think, holy smokes, have we ever built a rich and beautiful community that has contributed to my own wisdom harvesting. And so I'm thrilled to be here as a co-host today, and always thrilled to have a dialogue with these amazing change makers. And I admire Brenda so much. And so I'm thrilled that we get to be in conversation with her today. So I'm going to pass it over to my dear sister, Sharon. Over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and welcome everyone. I am thrilled to be here as well, and thrilled that Brenda is our guest speaker today. I am Sharon Marshall. I'm one of the co-hosts, and I am a Métis Cree woman from Treaty 6 territory, and I was born in Edmonton, but I reside on Vancouver Island, and so where I live, work, and play today is the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Snuneymuxw and the Snuneymuxw First Nations. And I am thrilled to be here, and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Charlene Sinjenko. I'm the founder of Powerhouse, and I am an Indigenous woman from the Splatsk'cheen community of the Shuswap Nation. I am thrilled to be the one to introduce our guest today, and thrilled to be hosting you with my beautiful braid from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Squamish people here on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. So welcome. A little bit about Brenda Morrison. I will read the formal bio and then I'll add just a few personal bits because she is a cherished soul within our Powerhouse community. Brenda is the director of the Center for Restorative Justice and an associate professor in the School of Criminology. She is a social psychologist with teaching, research, and field experience in outdoor education, governance, and justice. She completed her PhD at the Australian National University, and following her PhD, she worked at a postdoc with the Regulatory Institutions Network at the Center for Restorative Justice. For 3 years, she led a juvenile justice research and development project at the University of Pennsylvania in partnership with a range of justice, human services, and school-based institutions. Internationally, she has presented papers at the House of Lords and UNESCO. Nationally, she's a research partner with PrevNet. I hope saying that right. Promoting Relationships Eliminating Violence Network, Children's Rights Academic Network, and serves on the board of Smart Justice Canada. Believe it or not, there is much more. I'm going to leave it at that, but I think you get the picture. We are thrilled to walk beside a person who has dedicated her life and her gifts to doing what she can to restore and work with folks in a different way. I had the pleasure of attending a workshop with my good friend Tina O not too long ago, and I was able to see some of Brenda's work in action, and it really deeply impacted me. So I look forward to this conversation. Welcome, Brenda, and please let us know what else you'd like us to know about you this morning and how you're kind of entering the space.
Wow. Oh, it's so great to be with you all, and thanks for the warm introduction, Charlene. I'm calling in like Tina O from the unceded, traditional, ancestral, stolen land of the Squamish Nation, a little island in the Northern Pacific. Niqualaquam, also known as Bone Island, and I'm so grateful for the stewardship of this land and place over time immemorial. I've had the opportunity to raise my family here, and it's a great place to call home. So what's on my mind? I don't know. I think I just feel huge shifts happening right here and now in many different ways, and maybe I'll try to weave them together in different ways, what that shift is all about, because I think my practice of restorative justice is a way of leaning into that and contributing to some of the narratives that we hold about justice, and then enacting those narratives in embodied ways that we can deepen our humanity.
Well, that sounds like a beautiful jumping off point, Brenda, because in season 10 of Gather, we're opening with every guest around a purpose conversation. Like we're starting from that place. And it comes from Gail Stepanek-Kaber, whom you know, also in the house, who does purpose work. And the way she positions purpose work is, why does your organization exist? Or as you might even look at it from your own drive around what you do in the world. Like, can you tell us about, I don't want to say tell us about your purpose, because that sounds so, but like the purpose underneath, the direction of your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, Well, I won't give you the long story, but because I think your purpose is always there. It sometimes takes a while to recognize it. So I think I was drawn to the field of restorative justice, and now I have the great pleasure to run a center at a university that enables me to practice that purpose in different ways. And this idea of restorative justice is complex, and it has many different facets, and it has many different tributary streams that have added to the river. And many are the founding father of this idea of restorative justice wrote a book a number of years ago, and he said restorative justice is a journey, it's a river, and it's going to change and widen and move this way and that way. And when I think about it, I think about I went to hear a number of thought leaders or leaders like the Dalai Lama present a number of years ago, and they were asked, what is our greatest threat to humanity? And the Dalai Lama answered, we've raised a generation of passive bystanders. And what the practice of restorative justice does is it shifts the conversation from passive bystanders to active upstanders. And so through a range of mechanisms, restorative justice grew out of dissatisfaction with certain aspects of a criminal legal system that asks particular questions and responds to injustice in particular ways. And so what restorative justice offers us is an opportunity to be upstanders, not bystanders. It asks different questions. So, in a criminal legal session, the first question is, what rule has been broken? In a restorative justice process, the first question is, who's been harmed? What are their needs? Whose obligation is it to respond to those needs? It shifts the questions from, in a criminal legal system, the real point is fact-finding. It separates reason from emotion. It separates our head from our heart. Restorative justice finds reason for emotion. It connects our head with our heart. A restorative justice process doesn't focus on passive responsibility through punishment. It offers an opportunity to repair the harm done. And it does that through, active engagement. It's not a mechanism of social control like our criminal legal system. It's a mechanism of social engagement. And instead of a lot of third parties making the decisions, like the lawyers and the judges, the people most affected by the wrongdoing get a voice. And in that voice, they take their power back. And because, part of a criminal legal system, it steals the power away from us and gives more power. A crime is a wrong against the state. We need to have more active social responsibility in our own backyard. So restorative justice for me is a shift from passive, passive bystanders, and we have a lot of that, to active responsibility for harms caused in your own backyard.
I love that.
That's where I'm going.
Can I ask a question? Brenda, have you ever read Gary Zukav's Seat of the Soul?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so he talks about justice and I forget the term, a non-judgmental justice, basically. And so that's what you're talking about there. So with restorative justice is that you don't have one person that's residing as the judge over somebody's supposed crime. So can you tell me more? Can you tell us more about how that process works and for getting justice and how and and what was the catalyst for you that made you decide that that was something that you felt you wanted to learn more about?
Right. Okay. Well, I'll start there. So my research, asks the question, what shifts conflict to cooperation? And so when I was down at the Australian National University, and so what shifts that is some form of justice and some form of changing the relationality between the parties. And so a restorative justice process asks different questions, and it goes through a different procedural sort of points, and it looks like many different things, and there's many different models. Some of those models came from Indigenous ways of knowing and being up in the Yukon. Some of it came from the Mennonite tradition, where when they noticed, when they observed wrongdoing, they said, maybe we should do something different. Like, maybe we should hold, instead of being accountable to the state when you do wrong, maybe you should be accountable to those most affected, the victims of the crime. So in particular, it gives victims a voice, because victims become passive bystanders to their own crime. At the very best, they give a witness, they give a statement to the court. So it really invites, a process really invites engagement with those most affected by the harm. And while it grew out of dissatisfaction with certain aspects of a criminal legal system, it's now being applied in schools. It's being applied in the healthcare system here in BC. It's being applied to environmental harms. The questions are so deep, they can go many different places, like a river. Something like this. And so instead of a fact-finding mission, everyone gathers in the process and they tell their story. The question usually begins with a prompt, what happened that day? And so people can contextualize the facts, and it gives those facts deeper meaning, deeper understanding of what was happening for that person that day. So we don't extract the facts out of context. The story gives the facts the context, and that provides deepens the relationality and the understanding, so people can better understand what was happening for us as individuals that day when the harm occurred. From the storytelling phase, we deepen it, and we say, how are you affected? How are you affected by what happened that day? And people are affected socially. When you're harmed, you experience trauma. And part of that trauma sometimes becomes avoidance. You don't go back to the place of the harm. You avoid certain relationships. And so understanding how people were affected makes a big difference. One of the first restorative justice processes I witnessed down in Australia, there was a young man had vandalized a school significantly. And there was a restorative justice process. The police had diverted the case to a restorative justice process, and a number of people had gathered, like the people at the school that were affected, the principal, some teachers. But you also bring into the process a community of care for everybody who's there. And in the community of care that came with the young man who had vandalized the school were his parents and his grandmother. And it was what his grandmother said, because the others were just wagging fingers, you naughty boy, this is what happened. But what his grandmother said when she was asked the question, how are you affected? She says, Johnny, I've always loved and respected you. You come by my house. on your way back from school. And everyone knows that you're my grandson. And everyone knows what happened last weekend. And Johnny, I don't go to my bingo anymore. I don't, your behavior has affected me. I can't show my face in the community because everyone knows that you're my grandson. And Johnny had reason to be angry with the school for his own reasons. But the last person he expected to be affected by his actions was his grandmother. And Johnny hearing that changed the whole dynamic. That's what shifted him from, because he didn't care. He was like, yeah, I vandalized the school. So what? It was like, but when he heard that he affected his grandmother, he became an upstander. He took active responsibility for repairing the harm done. Sometimes not for yourself to begin, but for someone that you love and care for. And so getting the right people in the process is essential. You have to have the right people in the circle. And people that the people taking responsibility love and respect. Because sometimes when you can't do it for yourself, you can do it for them. And from that stage, because so much comes up in that point of the process, when people take, active responsibility, that's when we can move on to that question. Whose obligation now is it to repair the harm done? What do we need to do now? And once all of that is in the middle of the circle, we make decisions and people take responsibility and people reach out to each other and we deepen that rich web of relationality that is so important to our lives. Does that help?
Just a little bit, Brenda. And I want to pass to Shar because I know there was something bubbling up for you. And thank you so much.
One of the words, there was a few words that really popped out when you were speaking, Brenda, but the one that I want to chew on for a minute is actually the word context. For me, the story's on the move right now in terms of context. And I'll just share quickly. I attended a workshop last week with people that I did not know. And it was a locating workshop. And so we practiced introducing ourselves based on a framework that was led by our Indigenous sister, Echo Alec. And it was fascinating to me how we started to interact as, first of all, strangers, but then going through a process where we started to introduce ourselves through a certain framework and have more context as to who each other really were as people, where they're at in their lives, where they're coming from. And I'd never been through a process in such a short period of time that had me more deeply understand why someone might come at something a certain way than going through that process. And I was like, it just reinforced. And when you said it again today about how important context is to a situation, if we want to build a deeper understanding about ourselves and each other and how we relate to each other, we have to have that context. And I can't believe it's not more intentionally pulled through our systems. I'm gonna leave it at that, but context really jumped out. Yeah.
It's so true. The practitioners in the field of restorative justice are actually partnering with architects now to really expand our understanding of context in creating safety.
Wow. I want to toss to you, Christina. I'm just wondering from a systems. Oh, you already took your mic off. Take over. Go for it.
Actually, I'm not going to take the systems lens approach, but I just have a question about how do you set the table for holding tension in the room, right? Because again, everybody comes into the room, they're having a different experience, they have a different story in their head, and oftentimes we don't necessarily like tension. We actually want to resolve it, and sometimes we want to resolve it sooner than it ought to be resolved, right? There's just kind of a magical way through that when you bring resolution too soon, you actually haven't done the experience, that you haven't given it its due. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit more about how do you set the table for the role of tension, so that the kind of tension where it's just the right amount of tension, not too much where everything snaps and falls apart, or not too little where it's milquetoast, right? It's how do you hold space for tension?
Right. First of all, it happens with preparation. You don't bring people together without a lot of preparation. And you would never, and restorative justice is a voluntary process. People aren't there for the right reasons. The facilitators, you have to be there for the right reasons. And so lots of preparation. And sometimes it's not just one process. Sometimes it starts with just a couple of parties, and then the circle grows bigger as the learning and growth expands. And so it's not just a one stop practice. So sometimes it just takes time, and sometimes you do need breaks in the process. I mean, restorative justice process can, last from 1 hour to a full day and many days. So, but the really interesting thing is to, and we do this as a culture all the time, is not to try to fill the space, like for people to feel the tension. Remember, I said, we separate the head from our heart. Our head wants to fill the space with other things just to avoid that feeling in the room. That we need to embody that tension and feel it, and not go quick to, for like facilitators have to learn that, it's a difficult teaching for some people to say, okay, just let people just be with that tension right now. And the other thing we prepare people is that, and this is the idea of, this is the first important, is in the storytelling phase, is deep listening. Deep listening is essential. So it's, there's elders have told me that's why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, because we're supposed to listen at least twice as much as we speak. And so when you use a talking piece and other modalities for managing these processes, listening is really important. You have to listen to understand. And there's a great TED Talk that I would love the watchers by Judy Atkinson down in Australia, and she talks about deep listening. And deep listening was a gift from an Indigenous elder down in Australia, Dr. Miriam Rose Ungamir Boyer. Bowman, that's Bowman. And she's an Indigenous elder, and she gifted Australia this idea of deep listening. And she says, to know me, and because restorative practices is about knowing each other. To know me is to breathe with me. To breathe with me is to listen deeply. And so that's the tone that you want to bring into this conversation, is deep listening. And we have similar, back in Newfoundland and Labrador, they have a 2-ear listening project that has just emerged in the last 2 years. It's a gift to our nation from Chief Miesel Joe. and they have a great website. I would really welcome people to look at the two-ear listening project, because that's where it starts. And when we can listen, and we have to deeply listen and listen to what that tension is telling us and embody it, because it's the way that we're going to carry the teachings with us that move out of the restorative justice process.
Thank you, Brenda. I think we probably have some new people joining us. So I just want to reset the room for just a moment. If you've just landed in this conversation with Brenda Morrison and all of us here on Gather, finding us here on LinkedIn, this is Gather for Her. It's a powerhouse masterclass series unpacking what it means to be a relational leader in these unprecedented times of global change. And it's brought to you by Powerhouse, and it's produced by Regen Media. And we're here live every 2 weeks on LinkedIn, followed by an hour-long wisdom circle, as I'm sure you can already tell that you're going to want to unpack this in a bigger way. And we hold these wisdom circles in our community of practice called the Leader Path, which is our relational leadership gym, where we bridge Western leadership practices with relational ways of leading guided by Indigenous wisdom. You can find out more about that at powerhouse.com. And again, if you're new, this is a live conversation, so we encourage you to introduce yourself to us, to each other here in the chat on LinkedIn. And let's go back to our guest. Brenda, you've already segued us into our second circle, which really was about tips. It was about, what are your top relational leadership tips? And I love the way you ended the last piece about taking the restorative justice impact or process, if you will, like breathing into our lives. And because it's one thing to think about relational ways of being in this with an outcome in mind, restorative justice, but it's another way to look at it in the way we lead, or the way we simply are in our families and in our communities. And I just wonder if you have any relational leadership tips that you haven't already covered.
I think deep listening is really important. But I also think is sometimes when you're in leadership roles, it's important to create these safe spaces and then get out of the way. Just create the safe space and get out of the way. And I learned that, and to center the center the voices of those most affected. So I do work in children's rights, and I think children have a lot to teach us. And I had the great pleasure with working with Senator Pearson around her work in children's rights, and that's who taught me that through an initiative called Shaking the Movers. She said, your job, Brenda, is to create the space and get out of the way to center the voice of children. And so I think I took that seriously, and I took that teaching to other parts of my, whose voice are we centering here? And so when I started doing work with Indigenous initiatives at Simon Fraser University, and we're particularly in around a dream colloquium on returning to the teachings that I had the opportunity to bring to SFU. My job was to create the safe space and get out of the way and center out other voices. So that's something else I've learned. Sometimes good leadership is getting out of the way.
That changes everything. Yeah, go ahead, Shar.
I would love to just deep dive just for a couple of minutes on deep listening, because I think it is so valuable, and I think people are open to it. But I'd love for each of us to reflect on a practice that we might hold or be present to in order to listen more deeply. Because we kind of throw that phrase around, but I'd love to ground it in, and here's what you could practice perhaps doing better. As an example, because I'm the one bringing this up, but as an example, I am by nature the person that is already thinking about my response to what you're saying, because I'm so excited to tell you what you're inspiring me to say. I'm already done the whole book, and I just want, to get to the end. And so, knowing that about myself, I actually practice listening beyond the words that you're saying. So I listen. I listen by what I see. I listen energetically. I watch your body. And that keeps me like engaged in the moment, because if I only listen to the words coming out your mouth, I won't stay present with you. I don't deep listen that way. And I also have to like really feel my feet a lot when I'm listening. I just have to keep wiggling my toes. And I'm curious what other people do. And I'm curious if our listeners, have ideas, because I think it's so important. I'd love to deep dive just for a couple of minutes on it.
I'll jump in. So like you, Shar, I watch the body language intently, and it's more difficult, of course, when we're in the Zoom space or online, but still there's little nuances that we can pick up on. And then, there's the voice, your volume, cadence, all of that. But one other thing that I do is I try to come in with without any bias. And so I had an interview recently, and a lot of people would have prepared for it, and it was for me to facilitate for this organization. And I didn't do any prep work beforehand because I didn't want to come in with any expectations. I wanted to come in fresh and be my most authentic self. And so that to me is part of deep listening. It's because I used to be so worried of, okay, like even with these gathers, like the season 1, I would be concerned about what am I going to say, and I'd be preparing my saying before whatever I had to say before. So I'm not really listening. I'm listening, but not. It's, now it's totally changed the way I listen by doing that. So thank you for the question. Anybody else?
I wanted to mention there's a project that I've been following in Australia called Listening to Country, and we work with incarcerated women, Indigenous women in prison in Australia, and Indigenous women are the fastest growing population in all colonial countries around the world, and so we have to ask, why is that? Why is it that the overall population is falling? We're still locking up more Indigenous women. Whose needs are being met and whose needs are not being met? So there's a great project. You can just Google it. It's called Listening to Country, and we connect women in prison with the sound of their belonging, and it's beautiful to witness.
Thank you for that, Brenda. Because I think what you just offered, what I heard anyway, and what you said is the sound of their belonging. And I was like, that's deep listening. That's what it is. And what we're open to discovering is how we get to that spot. And so it might start with wiggling your toes, or start with, and then move into not preparing, but rather being available. And then after that spot, I don't know. I'm sure it's an individual journey for each person. I think even what I'd offer to our listeners is that it's a practice to even know how you listen. Some of us listen in pictures. Some of us listen in body sensory. Yeah, like for me, I don't know that I listen this way, but I hear in images, that become words, but I don't see words. I hear images. Um, and I too, Sharon, like you, don't prepare because I want to respond in a body sensory way and then have space for the images that are in my head. And I try really, really hard to not say my agenda, which is hard for me because I'm a director by nature. So I really try to. I love what you said, Brenda, about whose voice are we centering here? And I don't know that I'm great at it, but I try to be. Like, I try to put the story between us as the center of what I'm listening for. Yeah, it's a great question, Shar. And I'd love your feedback, Brenda, too. Oh, over to you, Christina. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think listening is so multi-sensory. At least that's what it is for me. And it's feeling, it's seeing, it's words, it's context, but it's also paying attention to what's actually going on in my own storytelling brain, right? Um, and so it's almost like being in the listening and observing the listening, like being meta to the listening. So, because I know for myself, and maybe some other folks can relate to this, is that sometimes I have a hard time distinguishing between what is mine and what is somebody else's. And so when I'm meta to it, I can see it a little clearer. And that's been a practice that's I've developed over time, because for the longest time I couldn't tell what's mine and what somebody else's. So and that recognizing again that we're all in relationship to one another. So we talk so much about relational leadership, and that we really are in this interdependent relationship with one another that that is both within our own experience and within the experience of others. So it's so multi-sensory. And I imagine that you've probably really had to develop that in your own practice, to be able to hold space for some big emotions and big stories filled with the potential for things to go sideways or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so you need to know your boundaries, definitely. A compassionate circle has good boundaries too, and knowing your own is really important, and knowing your own self is really important. So one of the and so people talk about self-care, what are you doing to care for yourself so you're not carrying too much of a load. I know when I've made mistakes in facilitating a restorative justice process or otherwise, and this is something I learned from an elder, is said, you're carrying too much. What do you need to let go of, Brenda? You're carrying too much. And that's when you have to go in and do a deep listening practice, like inward. You're not listen. It's important to listen to others, but it's really important to listen to yourself too. And one of the exercises that I give my students, and in other contexts, is I said, we have to turn up as our whole selves, and our whole selves will have boundaries and triggers and stories. And so, and I did it a different way in a class this time last year. I asked the students to do a personal métissage, to know who they are and where they belong, and that's to know who they are and where they belong. That gives us a different type of security than the security of the state. It's to have, and it's called ontological security. Ontological security is knowing who you are and where you belong. And when you have that type of security, you're less likely to hurt other people or hurt yourself. You know, it's in many ways. And so they were invited to do a métissage, and they were asked to weave together 3 strands of their own life story. One was about voice, who hears you. One was about safety, where are the place, and you feel safe in places called home. Where are the places you call home, that brings safety for you? And also around place. Where are those places, like the sense of place? And they weave together, and they can use different mediums. But it was so amazing to read those métissages. So I think inviting that practice, I mean, to step into any challenging work as a leader or otherwise, you need to know who you are and where you belong. And this practice of a métissage and a personal weaving, like you can weave together people, but there's also strands of who you are that you can weave together and reflect on. And it's really always a beautiful process and then I invite the students to sit in circle, and we share our métissages, and that's very validating for a person. So restorative justice practices can be proactive or, in response to a wrongdoing or harm.
We're just coming up to our last round, our last little bit, and you've already beautifully, as usual, Brenda, just brought us there already, which was it was the question around resilience, and it makes me what you just brought forth reminds me of the conversation with Patricia Crow in our fire circle around when she was talking about how she used to walk into boardrooms as an Indigenous woman and be the only woman there, and would be afraid, fearful. And eventually what she did was she reminded herself that she's not alone in this room. Who she is and where she belongs, and all of her ancestors are in this room with her. And it's how she dissipated fear from her experience. And so I would say that's like one of like a resilience tip, if you will. I mean, it's a bigger than that, but I hear resilience in what you're offering us here. And yeah, curious if there's anything else there that you would bring forth.
No, I think that's knowing who you are, like really grounding yourself in different practices. And right now, everyone's talking about self-care, but really caring for yourself is knowing who you are and where you belong, and really connecting to that in a way that we do it with the women in prison. What is the sound of your belonging? And it's really beautiful. It's really interesting. Some of my strongest teachings have been in prison, because you can just get really raw there. And sometimes that's what it takes to go to places that you need to go to.
Thank you. Well, let's wrap this up with a generous time for each of us to share what we're leaving with today, how this conversation is finding its way in our heart. Yeah, maybe you want to go first? What you're leaving with today? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. I mean, there are so many nuggets. Thank you so much. I feel like I wrote a bunch of notes about things I just want to dig more deeply into. But I think the piece that I will take for sure is the sound of your belonging and the sound of my belonging. I'm just gonna sit with that. But thank you for that, and I'm definitely gonna look that project up.
Oh, thank you, Brenda. Again, I always get so much out of listening to you share from your wisdom, your well of wisdom. And right at the beginning, you talked about, the focus of our justice system is what's the rule that's been broken, right? You know, I watch our systems very focused on rules and policies and procedures, and we forget the why, and the people and the relationship, and that includes the land and the water and the air. And so, you know, when you ask the question, who's been harmed, who's been impacted, what's your story? And I can't help but think, like, so for me, even expanding that to the water and the land and the air, in all of the ways that we, so it's not just the people, it's also what are the ways that we are impacting our earth that we rely on. And so again, I think about, we're struggling in our poly crisis of where it's like, okay, we're trying to put rules in place, and if we don't hold the relationship tenderly and exquisitely and generously, then we're missing it. So thank you. I got just so much out of what you said. So thank you.
So, Brenda, yeah, there's so much. I was hoping we would talk a little bit about the women in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
but we didn't get there. And just the word resilient comes to mind for me with them, as so many other things here that we've talked about. I guess along the lines of Christina, the restorative justice piece really is, it's very intriguing to me. What I see and hear is, you know, the two-eared hearing is really important. And what came to my mind automatically was the two-eyed seeing, and how restorative justice is a two-eyed seeing, a way of dealing with justice. And then to know one is to know me is to breathe with me. That is something I'm going to spend some time with, because that really hit me. To know me is to breathe with me. So thank you so much, Brenda.
Thanks. For me, Brenda, you know, I'm laughing inside because we have a mutual friend we all know, Mary Beth Dean, who is also my writing partner. And whenever we're around Brenda, Mary Beth always says, I'm just gonna follow Brenda and write everything down. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna follow her with my notebook and write everything down. And what I'm leaving with today is, and it's something that's been on my mind for like a few weeks, is, and it sounds silly, but as a 51-year-old woman about to turn 52, I'm recognizing I've actually been wrong about a lot of things. And I don't mean wrong, good, bad, right, wrong, like that. More like I thought it was this, but that was actually programmed thought, not listening thought. And the humility in that. And so it was the statement of whose needs are not being met. And so I'm really landing in that from the blind spot as, a very privileged white person that doesn't always see the needs that I don't see, that I just don't see because I've never been, because I don't see them. So that's what I'm leaving with. And from a very loving place, like the compassion that you offered in this space. So not just I'm wrong, but the compassionate invitation of what I don't know. So thank you, Brenda.
I just also want to say that I'm also leaving with great curiosity, because there is so much about you that I did not know. In your bio, like, there is so much. So we have to talk, because I'm just blown away.
How about you, Brenda? Over to you.
Wow. I'm so grateful that you brought up the women of Afghanistan, because we need to center their voice too. There's a lot of harm being rippling out in places like Afghanistan, it's not on the radar again. We need to bring it back on the radar. Harm for any woman is a harm. We need to center all the voices. And I had the great honor to bring an Afghan. We brought her here about a year ago. It was a journey in itself. That's a whole different conversation on what leadership means. Good leadership means a quiet cup of tea on some days. So I stood on the steps of the art gallery last weekend with some really strong Afghan women, and I listened to their voice. But what was really interesting, because they always spoke they at times spoke their own language, but I felt every word that they said. I felt every single word, and I felt, each of us carries a song in our heart, and I heard the song in their heart. And so that's what we have to listen to. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brenda. And thank you, all of our listeners and our community. Thank you for joining us on Gather for Her, a Powerhouse Masterclass series unpacking what it means to be a relational leader in these unprecedented times. We want you to know that this conversation has been recorded, because you'll want to listen to this one again and again and again. And it's going to be shared on our YouTube channel and as a podcast renamed as The How for Her, which you can find on Spotify and all the other places that you listen. Gather for Her is hosted by Powerhouse, where we walk beside leaders to amplify their change work as they walk their path of whole leadership, guided by relational leadership practices and Indigenous wisdom. We want to thank our impact media producer and sister company, Regen Media, who reminds us that we can take the power of media into our own hands when we support stories that heal, regenerate, uplift, and transform. And thank you to the hands that are back here at Powerhouse and Regen's digital storytellers, Zoe Gray, Madeline Archibald, and Willow Smith. Thank you to my co-hosts and my sisters in change, the Braid of Powerhouse, Charlene, Christina, Sharon, and our new guests joining us, not guests, hosts, Kelly and Janet. And to our listeners, our community of change makers, leaders, and social impactors, thank you for walking with us in co-creation of the world that we're living into together. You're always welcome here each week on Gather for Her. There's always a place for you in Powerhouse and on the path. And just thank you for being with us and doing the great, beautiful change work you're doing. We will see you next week. Thank you, everybody.